So Tom Parker BS is driving around with Princess Diana's private letters in his car trunk. And now the entire monarchy is facing a crisis nobody saw coming. Just in, Diana's confidential files found inside a palace guest's car. And the excuse Tom gave for having them? Honestly, it somehow makes the whole thing even more suspicious. He claims someone gave him the documents for a book project. A book project? We're talking about Diana's private handwritten letters, sensitive government papers, and documents marked confidential. And somehow they ended up in the trunk of a food writer's car. Royal shock. What were Diana's private files doing there? Before we get into what happened next, make sure you subscribe to Crown Watch so you don't miss the royal stories happening behind the palace walls. Now let's go back to the beginning, because the timing makes this whole situation even more explosive. This wasn't some ordinary evening. It was the night of a grand banquet at Buckingham Palace. Golden lights, chandeliers, world leaders, ambassadors, celebrities, the kind of royal event where every detail is planned down to the smallest gesture. Charles was finally king after waiting longer than any heir in British history, and this banquet was supposed to demonstrate that the monarchy was stable, powerful, and united under his reign. William and Catherine arrived looking immaculate. Charles and Camilla entered together as cameras flashed around them. And then Tom Parker BS arrived in a sleek black car, dressed perfectly, looking like any other guest. But to William, he was anything but ordinary. 1 minute ago, William spots Camilla's son, and his expression changes instantly. Tom represented a part of Camilla's family that William had never fully accepted, and the moment he stepped out of that vehicle, William's jaw tightened. He watched him carefully, but said nothing. Inside the banquet hall, everything appeared perfectly normal. A string orchestra played softly. Crystal glasses reflected the lights. Ministers laughed. Guests exchanged polite compliments. Toasts were made about unity, history, and the future of the monarchy. Tom sat only a few seats away from Charles, casually discussing restaurants, food, and life outside palace walls. Some guests found him charming. William didn't. To William, that laughter felt completely out of place. Royal tension. William watches without saying a word. And Harry wasn't even there to witness any of it. Across the ocean, he had chosen a completely different life, far away from palace dinners and carefully controlled smiles. His absence only added another layer of tension to an already uncomfortable night. Then the banquet ended. Guests began leaving. Cars lined the palace courtyard beneath the lanterns. Charles excused himself from Camilla and said he needed some air. He walked through the marble corridors and stepped outside. Guards stood silently at their posts. The black vehicles waited in neat rows. And then Charles noticed something strange. Tom's car trunk wasn't completely closed. There was a small gap, barely noticeable. But at Buckingham Palace, where security is treated with absolute seriousness, nothing should be left open. Breaking. King Charles opens Tom's trunk and freezes. Charles approached the vehicle, hesitated, looked around, and finally lifted the trunk lid. What he saw made him stop cold. Hidden beneath a dark cloth were stacks of old documents, sealed envelopes, folders tied with red string, and papers carrying government markings. And sitting almost perfectly on top was one folder with bold words across the cover. Diana, confidential. Charles's face went pale. He stared at the folder as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then a voice suddenly came from behind him. "Father, what are you doing?" William had arrived. Royal shock. William seized the Diana files inside the trunk. His eyes moved from Charles to the open trunk, and his expression changed instantly. First came disbelief. Then came fury. Now here's where everything gets completely out of control. Tom's explanation was that he hadn't stolen anything. He claimed someone had given him the files. According to him, a man he had worked with, someone involved in rare documents, told him that he had information connected to Diana and that the material could potentially be worth millions. Tom said he didn't believe the story at first, but after seeing the documents, he supposedly took them because he wanted to keep them safe. Just in, Tom claims he was protecting Diana's files. Safe. In his car trunk. At a royal banquet. Inside Buckingham Palace. That's the part that immediately raises questions. If you genuinely wanted to protect sensitive documents, why carry them around in your vehicle? Why not put them in a secure location? Why not immediately alert palace security? Why bring them to the one place where their discovery could cause maximum damage? William wasn't interested in excuses. He pointed toward the trunk and demanded answers. His voice was controlled, but the anger was obvious. "These are private files about my mother. Where did you get them?" Tom repeated the same explanation. He said the documents were connected to a book project. Royal bombshell. A book project is Tom's explanation for Diana's confidential files. William looked at him in disbelief. The idea that Diana's private letters had somehow been handed to a food writer as research material was almost impossible for him to accept. Tom's professional world revolved around restaurants, food, and reviews. Yet somehow, according to his explanation, highly sensitive royal material had landed in his hands. Charles tried to calm the situation, but the tension was already beyond control. He reached into the trunk and pulled out one envelope. His hands were trembling as he opened it. Inside was a letter written in Diana's unmistakable handwriting. Charles stared at the page. These weren't just government records. They were fragments of Diana's private thoughts. William watched his father's reaction, and his anger only grew stronger. Palace in crisis. Charles is holding Diana's private letter in his hands. Then William delivered the warning that changed everything. He told his father that this had to end immediately. If Charles protected Tom again, William said, their relationship could be damaged beyond repair. The heir was drawing a line that even the king couldn't ignore. And then the story exploded inside the palace. 1 minute ago, Camilla learns that William has seen Diana's letters. By dawn, the news had reached Camilla. A single message was quietly passed through the royal household. The trunk had been opened. William knew. He had seen the letters, and Tom was the one caught carrying them. Camilla immediately understood the danger. Diana's memory had always been one of the most sensitive subjects surrounding her marriage to Charles, and now Diana's private writings had somehow returned to the center of the royal story. Camilla rushed to the courtyard and found Charles standing beside the car while Tom remained nearby. She was furious. She demanded to know what he had been thinking. Tom repeated that he was only trying to keep the documents safe. Camilla's response was devastating. Safe? She questioned how hiding them in a car trunk could possibly be called safe. Safe from whom? William? Charles? Palace security? Herself? Royal shock. Camilla demands to know who Tom was really hiding the files from. And that question becomes one of the biggest mysteries surrounding the entire incident. Because none of the explanations seem to fit perfectly. If Tom wanted to protect the documents, why bring them to the palace? If he wanted to publish them, why hide them? If he wanted to sell them, why risk carrying them into a royal event? And if he truly believed he was helping, why didn't he immediately tell someone who could secure them properly? Breaking. The trunk may have answered one question and created 10 more. Camilla broke down emotionally. She told Charles that William would now have another reason to resent her. She feared that the discovery would reopen decades of anger surrounding Diana. And then she reportedly said something that stunned even Charles. She said that Diana had somehow won. The documents weren't simply pieces of paper anymore. They had become symbols of a rivalry that Camilla felt she had never been able to escape. Royal shock. Camilla fears Diana's memory has returned to haunt the monarchy. But William wasn't finished. He left the courtyard carrying more anger than he had arrived with. He told Charles that he would tell Catherine everything. He made it clear that this couldn't simply be buried inside the palace. For 2 days, officials attempted to contain the story. Reporters gathered outside royal residences. Questions multiplied. Was William fighting with the king? Were Diana's private letters really discovered inside Tom's car? Who gave him the documents? Why were they at Buckingham Palace? The palace remained silent, and that silence only made the speculation louder. Palace in crisis. No official answer as questions about Diana's files explode. Then William stepped outside Kensington Palace with Catherine beside him. Normally, he would offer a polite wave and say nothing. This time was different. He looked serious. He raised his hand and waited for the reporters to quiet down. Then William spoke. He said he wouldn't discuss every detail, but his mother's memory deserved honesty. He confirmed that personal belongings belonging to Diana had been discovered in a place where they should never have been. He described them as private letters and personal material that should have been protected. Just then, William breaks his silence on Diana's confidential files. He didn't reveal every detail, but his message was unmistakable. Diana's dignity, he said, would not be silenced. Within minutes, the story exploded worldwide. News stations began broadcasting the statement. Headlines appeared everywhere. Palace advisors scrambled to respond. Phones rang across royal offices. Statements were drafted, rewritten, and rejected. Charles sat quietly, visibly shaken. He had wanted the issue kept private. William had chosen transparency. And suddenly the monarchy was dealing with something far bigger than one person's trunk. Because this wasn't really about one night anymore. It was about decades of unresolved grief, anger, guilt, and silence. William had spent his adult life playing the disciplined heir. He appeared beside Camilla at public events. He smiled for cameras. He followed protocol. But seeing Diana's handwriting again brought all of those buried emotions rushing back. Royal shock. One open trunk reopens decades of family pain. The public reaction was immediate. Crowds gathered outside palace gates carrying photographs of Diana. Her interviews resurfaced. Old footage circulated online. People began debating whether William was defending his mother's memory or exposing a deeper failure inside the monarchy. Newspapers published images of Diana beside Camilla. The country divided into competing camps. Some supported William. Others defended Charles. Camilla faced the strongest criticism. Then Charles made the most dangerous decision of his reign. Breaking. King Charles decides to address the nation. His advisors warned him not to do it. They said confirming too much could make the situation worse. But Charles reportedly refused. He believed silence was no longer protecting the monarchy. It was damaging it. Camilla begged him to reconsider. She feared that speaking publicly about Diana would make the comparisons even more painful. But Charles had made up his mind. He would speak not simply as king, but as a father. That night, Charles appeared before the cameras. The room was silent. He acknowledged that Diana's personal letters and belongings had been found in circumstances that should never have happened. He acknowledged the pain it had caused, especially for William. And he spoke about Diana as the mother of his children, saying that her memory should always be respected. Then came the words that stunned the country. Charles accepted responsibility for the failure to protect Diana's memory properly and asked for patience, healing, and ultimately his son's forgiveness. Royal bombshell. Charles publicly asks William to forgive him. The reaction was immediate. Some people praised Charles for finally speaking honestly. Others argued that the statement raised even bigger questions about Camilla's position. Inside the palace, Camilla was devastated. Tom reportedly realized that whatever happened next, his name would forever be connected to the discovery. William watched his father's speech with Catherine beside him. He didn't celebrate. He didn't attack Charles. He simply listened. When the speech ended, Catherine asked whether he could forgive his father. William looked toward the dark window and admitted that he didn't know. The truth had finally been spoken, he said, but truth alone could not heal everything. And that's where this entire story ultimately lands. Not with the trunk, not with the confrontation, not even with the explosive public statement. It lands on a family that had spent years trying to manage grief through silence, protocol, and carefully controlled appearances. 1 minute ago, the palace may have closed the trunk, but the questions remain open. Tom Parker BS may have genuinely believed he was protecting those documents. Maybe someone really did hand them to him. Maybe the book project explanation was exactly what he claimed. But the circumstances remain difficult to explain. The open trunk, the palace banquet, the timing, the confidential markings, the strange explanation, and above all, the question of who originally gave him the material. Catherine later reflected privately on the damage the crisis had caused. She worried that William's anger, if left unresolved, could consume him. She understood that the crown was not a prize to be won. It was a burden carried from one generation to another, and burdens carried with anger can eventually break even the strongest person. The monarchy survived the headlines. It survived the speech. It survived the night. But the deeper fracture between father and son, between past and present, between Diana's memory and the modern monarchy, did not simply disappear. The trunk was closed again, but the questions remained wide open. Who really gave Tom the files? Why were they brought to Buckingham Palace? What else was hidden among those papers? And most importantly, what will William do with the fire his mother's memory has reignited? Because sometimes the most dangerous thing inside a royal palace isn't what someone says. It's what someone finds when they finally lift the lid.